Can machines really think?
I'm convinced that machines can and will think. I don't mean that machines will behave like men. I don't think for a very long time we're going to have a difficult problem distinguishing a man from a robot. And I don't think my daughter will ever marry a computer. But I think that computers will be doing the things that men do when we say they're thinking. I'm convinced that machines can and will think in our lifetime.
Maps that were never drafted, photographs that were never taken, letters that were never written, voices that belonged to no one. We're consuming more and more content that was generated by artificial intelligence, sometimes even without realising it. Welcome to Future Human, the series, the podcast where the team here at Silicon Republic explores the future of everything. I'm Anu D. This episode is about the future of artificial intelligence. This series is made possible by our presenting sponsor, Hays, that's Hays, is the world-leading expert in recruitment and workforce solutions, specialising in the professional and technical sectors and skills. Thanks to their support, the rest of this episode will be totally ad-free. To access great advice and insights, visit haztechnology.com/blogs. It feels like we're at somewhat of a crossroads when it comes to artificial intelligence. AI tech is advancing so quickly, and it has enormous potential to do good in fields from healthcare to education to climate mitigation. But like with all technologies, we need to be mindful of the potential harms. In this episode, we're focusing mostly on generative AI. That's the branch of AI used to generate content. That could be written content, audio, photographs. It could even be music or film. You give the system a prompt and it makes something based on what it has learned from existing data sets. One of its real strengths is its ability to summarise complex data sets into a coherent narrative, one of the reasons it's already been used extensively by researchers and academics. It is seen as having enormous potential to tackle some of our most pressing societal challenges. But coming back to those data sets, to the source data, if, for example, AI is using existing songs, illustrations, essays, photographs, research as its reference data, where is it getting access to that? Does it have permission from the original creators to use their material? Could this be intellectual property theft? And it's interesting to see this play out in the courts. In 2022, 3 artists in the United States sued several generative AI platforms for using their work without permission. While most of the claims were ultimately dismissed by the judge, one important claim went through, and that was a claim of copyright infringement. It was a fascinating test of existing copyright law, and we're likely to see a lot of similar cases like this in the coming years. And that's just one facet of how we figure out the place of AI in our society, in our businesses and in our workplaces. But above all, we have to figure out how to balance the risks of AI with its potential to do some serious good. This episode is all about navigating these tensions. So I began by speaking with Juliette Powell, the author of The AI Dilemma.
The AI dilemma is really about the fact that the technology itself could be beneficial to all of us on this planet. At the same time, in the wrong hands, it could be incredibly dangerous, especially to vulnerable populations. And so we have to be stewards of the technology. If you look at things like computer vision, for example, which is a component of machine learning, we've seen time and time again how computer vision has failed, especially when it originally came out a few years ago as a component of self-driving cars. So we had a really horrible experience here in the United States, and there have been several around the world since then. But the first one I think that really caught the attention of the everyday person in the United States was back in 2018.
First, the first of its kind deadly crash that left a woman dead in Tempe back in 2018. Tonight, 2.5 years later, a grand jury is indicting the backup or safety driver in the car with negligent homicide.
More than 2 years after a self-driving Uber hit and killed a woman in Tempe, the backup driver sitting in the front seat at the time of the crash facing a judge.
Self-surrender on a warrant for arrest.
A grand jury now charging Rafaela Vasquez with negligent homicide. That stems from a March of 2018 incident. Vasquez monitoring one of the futuristic cars, slamming into Elaine Herzberg, killing the 49-year-old as she walked her bike across Mill Avenue south of Curry Road. Herzberg not in a crosswalk. Vasquez talking with Tempe police shortly after the impact.
I didn't even see anybody over there.
Okay.
And
so she kind of came out of nowhere?
Yeah.
But a police report later indicating the safety driver was streaming TV shows on her phone for 3 hours that night, including at the time of the crash. Tempe investigators saying had Vasquez been paying attention to the road, she could have stopped the car 42 feet before impact. The NTSB slamming Uber for a lack of safety protocols in its self-driving program. However, the Yavapai County Attorney's Office did not recommend charges against the company. Uber quickly settling with Herzberg's family.
She was not crossing at an intersection. It was nighttime. And sadly, the vehicle wasn't quite sure what she was. Didn't necessarily determine that she was a human being, let alone a human being with a bicycle. And even though there was an operator in the car whose job it was to make sure that there were no such accidents, we have automation complacency. Most of us, we rely more on our technology than we do our own brains. We think that our technologies are smarter than us, especially when it has the title artificial intelligence, which, by the way, sounds more like marketing than it actually is. But when we think about these examples of real people dying because we're experimenting on people, we're experimenting on our society, and we have to determine whether we want to use things like machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence, generative AI for humanity, right? For the human race or for the arms race, or even more so, I think from what we're seeing is the tech race, right? These companies are making billions upon billions of dollars with a 70% increase year over year. If you're an investor in the company, that might make you incredibly happy. And at the same time, if you are somebody who, for example, in the case of self-driving cars and computer vision, are one of the people that has not traditionally been seen by the technology. So we're, of course, talking about women of color, we're talking about older people, children. Again, the quality of computer vision has gone up exponentially, mostly, I'd say, because of the work of an incredible researcher that came out of MIT, Joy Bulemi. She has her own book that came out at the end of October of 2023 that I highly recommend for anyone. But if you're not familiar with her work, one of the wonderful things that she did was a documentary where she was able to show how her own robot, so she was programming a robot at MIT, and her robot didn't recognize her until she wore a white mask. Why? Because computer vision is tuned mostly to those that create it, which are generally, Caucasian men. And as a result, she published her work. Many of the companies that, were highly biased when it came to, again, these vulnerable populations, pushed back. And they said, what do you mean? Like, show us your data. And so she did. She had published her data publicly. And as a result, they had to come back and tweak their models. But ultimately, I think for those of us that use these technologies, it's also on us to actually read the directions, read the instructions. Follow up, create our own training data, not just rely on the system as it is. We need to be critical thinkers, and we are as much part of this technology as this technology is part of us, and that these are really socio-technical systems. So we get to build these technologies, but at the same time, they're also shaping us. And the more they shape us, the more we shape them. And so it's very much a bilateral approach. I don't think that you can just rely on engineers when it comes to AI anymore.
How do we keep an eye on the organizations? How do we ensure that organizations are accountable? Does it come down to the organizations themselves, or do we need strong governance, strong regulation? And what are your thoughts on the kind of the rapid development of the regulation, particularly coming out of the EU?
It is very, very clear that this, again, we need to accelerate in order to reach our goals. Is very much at the forefront, not just of the government logic, but also of the corporate logic. The engineering logic, of course, falls beautifully into that because, yes, we want things to be much more efficient. We want things to be simple. We don't want people to have to think too much. We want people to be able to optimize as much within the organization as well as outside of the organization. But then you've got the whole social justice logic where people are saying, hold on a second, we're relying on all of this data, but what does this data represent? It represents people. It represents our lives and the way that we live and the way that we share information. And I think that looking at the regulation that's coming out of the AIA, the Artificial Intelligence Act of the EU, there is a lot of fear within big tech. On one end, because they are still in many cases still catching up to GDPR, right? I think that we underestimate to what extent big tech was not actually prepared for GDPR. And now with the AIA, I think, and the fines are much bigger and there are damages, it should be really interesting to see how much big tech is going to have to pay to play. At the same time, they're making so much money that I don't think that they're as worried as one might think that they would be in those shoes. What happens to smaller players, on the other hand, I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. Again, if we look at this idea of the Apex benchmark, where when you start a company, you are positive and you want to do the right thing. And the more your investors come in and potentially you go public, and now it's also public investors and they want to make money. That is your duty as a company, is to make money, to create value for your shareholders. Your competition's coming in, they're using the same tools or perhaps even developing faster than you. And so what do? Well, it's a slippery slope. And that's where I'm not sure that self-regulation works as well as we would like in an idealized system. And where I see self-regulation embedded into the AIA and self-reporting, it makes me a little nervous.
And there are quite a few things to be nervous about when it comes to AI. With generative AI, we get out of it what we put in. If the training data is faulty or indeed biased, then the AI's outputs will be similarly faulty or biased. Jenny Darmody from Silicon Republic explored this idea of bias in a conversation with Virginia Dignum. Virginia is a professor in responsible artificial intelligence and director of the AI Policy Lab at Umeå University in Sweden. Here's Jenny's interview with Virginia.
AI is, as let's say, global imagination is around since people are around. So this idea that we can build artificial entities that can help us or support us or extend our capabilities has been around since people are people, I think, and we see that in fiction and in philosophical and also religious documents from a long time. But the official birth of AI is in the 50s, starting with an idea by a group of mostly mathematicians and computer scientists at a time in which there was hardly computers that worked, but they had this vision that they could lay down precisely and mathematically description of how human reasoning worked, and that could be then used to generate systems that would help us understand the real concept of intelligence.
The thinking machine.
But what really worries me today is what's going to happen to us if machines can think. And what interests me specifically is, can they?
Well, that's a very hard question to answer. If you'd asked me that question just a few years ago, I'd have said it was very far-fetched. And today I just have to admit I don't really know. I suspect if you come back in 4 or 5 years, I'll say, sure, they really do think.
Well, if you're confused, Doctor, how do you think I feel?
We're just really beginning to understand the capabilities of the computers. I've got some film to illustrate this point, which I think will amaze you.
That man isn't playing checkers against a computer, is he?
Sure, and it plays pretty well.
Can machines really think?
I'm convinced that machines can and will think. I don't mean that machines will behave like men. I don't think for a very long time we're going to have a difficult problem distinguishing a man from a robot. And I don't think my daughter will ever marry a computer. But I think that computers will be doing the things that men do when we say they're thinking. I'm convinced that machines can and will think in our lifetime.
And since that technology has evolved, particularly in the last, I would say, decade, maybe a bit more, the ethical issues around AI have started to crop up, and particularly with generative AI now, there's a lot of regulation around that. Can you give me some real-world examples of sort of the biggest ethical issues that you see coming into play with AI as we currently know it?
So examples that we see again and again are issues of discrimination and bias. AI looks at patterns on data. If that data is not a good representation of the situation and the populations that it is trying to extrapolate to, of course, you will not be able to get the right conclusions. The systems cannot take the right conclusions out of that data. We see that, for instance, in medical data. Medical data is, for a large part, collected from specific demographics and often then is used for other demographics. For instance, what we still see, you don't really typically collect data about children, but you imagine or calculate that the children is a quarter of an adult or something like that. So then you apply it as being a small adult. So those are issues of bias. We also see that, for instance, in job or labor situations, if the historical data is biased towards a specific gender, the conclusions that the system is going to do is more aligned with the gender from which the historical data is about. So this is one of the big issues that we see on ethics of AI.
And there's a lot to unpack there in terms of how, those challenges could be addressed. But there are certainly certain issues there, particularly, I suppose, discrimination comes up again and again in terms of data being biased, that have been known about for a long time and they're still kind of cropping up. So what are your thoughts on how those are going to be addressed as we move further into the technology? What role is regulation going to play, for example?
Yes, so first thing we need to understand is that it is not possible to have completely bias-free data. By definition, once we decide to collect data, there is a decision about what is going to be collected, what not, what type of characteristics are going to be part of the data set, what characteristics are not there. And these are decisions that inherently imply bias because you cannot collect all different characteristics possible. So it is not possible to have bias-free data. What is possible and what I think regulation can demand is to make as explicit as possible what has been the choices that have been made. So why did we collect data about gender but not about age? Why did we collect data about, the color of your eyes but not the color of your socks? All those types of decisions that have been made need to be made explicit, made open also for other ones to understand. And what the system learns from the data to new situations need also to be accompanied with a clear specification of what can we say with the data that we have and what can we not say.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that idea of transparency seems to be the biggest issue around the AI technology, that sort of black box AI. And we talk a lot about, needing a human in the loop all the time to help stop algorithms running away with themselves. But can the human in the loop be truly effective, do you think, if there is still black box AI and the human can't see how algorithmic decisions are come to?
It's not necessarily that transparency means that we want or that we demand that all black boxes are made not black. The point is that we deal with other black boxes as well. We deal with organizations, for instance. We don't know how things internally in an organization work, but we are able to demand accountability from the organization in terms of what kind of decisions they make. With or without AI, doesn't really matter. I don't think that most of us who are interested at looking at pieces of software code and try to analyze what that code does or not. We also don't really know how my car works, but I trust that that will work in a way that is safe and reliable. And if that is not the case, I know that there will be organizations that can be held accountable for it. So we do need to change a little bit this idea that transparency in AI is about making the black box less black, but much more that transparency in AI is having the capability to understand if things go wrong, someone is going to take care of it. We as people, we have an incredible tendency to anthropomorphize everything. You probably talk with your computer. I talk with my car all the time. We will do that with AI, probably even more, because these systems are designed to behave in ways that are similar to us. I think we are able enough to understand that we are talking with a machine and not a person. And it is also important in cases in which this might be confusing, that the system announces itself as being a machine and not a person. It is an evolution, and of course, every evolution comes with positives and negatives. I think that we are going to see very quickly is the possibilities of AI to make healthcare more accessible, making education more accessible, making jobs more tailored to your own capabilities and to what you can do and what you really want to do, spreading the benefits of education in a much more equitable way than what we have now. Those type of issues are already happening and are going to happen more and more. And at the same time, also being aware of issues of misinformation, issues of deepfakes and so on, it will become more of an issue.
And finally, I just want to come back on the regulation side of it, because there's obviously been a lot of moves with the EU AI Act, and the UK are working to regulate as well. And how effective do you think those instruments are when the technology is moving so fast?
Technology is always developing, not only AI technology, but also it's any other technology. We have regulations about traffic, which are independent of whether you are using a bike, a self-driving car, a donkey, or a normal car. So the regulations about traffic are about the safety of interaction in the road. Independently of your car is big or small, electric or a gas, self-driving or not, the regulations will demand that the car has seat belts and the car has brakes. And none of us would want to drive on a car which has no brakes. What we see at this moment in AI is that AI is the equivalent to a car without brakes being driven by someone without driver's license. We need to start thinking about what are the seat belts for AI systems or the brakes for AI systems. What are the type of driver's license there?
I want to pick up on this idea of a safety belt for AI. It makes sense to design safety features for any technology that has the potential to do harm as well as good. But who designs the safety belt? Who decides on when and where we should wear it? Or indeed, who polices it? I spoke with Alessandro Curioni from IBM, who leads IBM research in Europe as well as global research in security and the future of computing. I wanted to get Alessandro's perspectives on how we might develop and regulate AI in an ethical and responsible way, and I began by getting his thoughts on where we're at with AI right now.
AI is probably the most transformational technology that we are experiencing in the past decades, right? No doubts. And there is a divergence between the positive and the negative, between, the utopic scenarios and dystopic ones, right? And by the way, this is the same for all technologies. So when you do have something like this, you have only two ways to act. One way is, is simply to say the technology itself require a lot of work, to be implemented and to show the positive outcomes and the negative ones that can be so bad, right? So let's stop everything, yeah? The second way is, the positive outcomes are so strong and so important, not only, because they bring business benefits, but because they can bring social benefits, and eventually they can, the technology can help to solve some of the problems that our world, our society has, that otherwise will be very difficult to be solved. And in that case, the only reasonable approach is exactly to try to come up with a proper way to build the technology. So you build the technology knowing which are the risks and trying to minimize the risk while you are building. And at the same time, right, put out regulation and governance to mitigate the risk, right, while allowing transparent and open development and application of the technology.
It's worth reflecting on the use cases for AI. When is it appropriate to use it and when is it not? When does it benefit communities and when does it harm them? Alessandro and I spoke about that tension between supporting the evolution of AI while mitigating the risks. I asked Alessandro about how we're approaching regulation and governance to date.
People started to think, to contribute, to create the right regulation, the right governance, et cetera, in the past few years, right? And this was done with the interaction, and I would say positive interaction of company, government, academic institution, and the society. And this is the only way you can do it. But what happened is that while we were creating rules, regulation, and governance, the field itself accelerated, by a factor of magnitude faster. So we had to rethink about everything. And there is a part of the world that say, oh my God, look, this is really impactful, but it can be super dangerous. Is going to accelerate even further, is going to become general, is going to take over the humans. So we have to stop everything, right? Or we have to stop and create very, very, very strong and hard regulation on everything from the system, the hardware, the algorithm, the application, the use cases, the user, everything. Eventually stop because it's very, very dangerous. By the way, if you look who is pushing in this direction are exactly, company organization that they have done the major advances in doing these things. So you can perceive as a way, to control the full field and simply say, we know how to do these things. All the others, they should not do it, right? The other things that you see is that, come on, this is so transformational that we do have to develop more and faster. So everything should be open. Regulation should be at minimum because, otherwise, we hamper the development of and the progress of the human species. And you can, if you think well, understand what there is behind. There is always, organization, states, people that are trying to optimize the outcome for themselves. That is my view.
And tell me just a little bit about IBM and Watson X governance.
Our approach is to have the technology that is secure by design, safe by design, that is developed in a responsible way, and I'm going to tell you what does it mean, to put the right governance that cannot be the one of one company or one nation, has to be, again, a governance where all academic, university, companies agree, right, to do the right thing. And for us, and also for me personally, I do believe that there are some principles that are very, very, very important. First of all, we should try to regulate the use cases. It makes no sense to put, regulation on an algorithm, on a network, the number of nodes, how it is done, because, this doesn't mean anything. And if you put regulation there without knowing the outcomes and the risk associated, there you risk, to prevent the development of positive outcomes. But we should look especially at use cases and try to come up with a regulation that is risk-based. There are certain things that they have a very high risk and a small positive impact. We should not do it. So use case, risk-based type of regulation. Definitely, it does not make sense, to devolve this regulation to a couple of companies that eventually maybe they decide what to do and what not to do on the basis of a licensing scheme. That makes no sense, right? Because we have to try to bring this to everybody. Yeah. The third thing is we need to push to try to make sure that we bring not all, but some accountability, responsibility to the people that are creating this algorithm. Okay, there are certain ways in which I build the thing that I should have the responsibility, the accountability if I do this wrong. If I bring in all data that I don't own to create a model, I am responsible of that. And so that is why if you put all these things and we move in this direction, I do believe that we can create a responsible AI developments that allow us to optimize the benefit and minimize the risk. By the way, a crucial thing to do this, it's also transparency and openness.
So how do we ensure the development of AI is driven not only by competition, but by community? As Alessandro pointed out, it will happen through collaboration and public involvement and true openness and transparency. And as we start to create legal and ethical frameworks for AI, who should have input into the process? We know the technology is moving more quickly than the law, and that we will to some extent be playing catch-up for much of this. In the meantime, how do we encourage tech companies to be good corporate citizens? How do we ensure they're developing these technologies responsibly? Juliette has said she's not sure that self-regulation will work, so I asked her who should be regulating AI.
As we've seen with the Artificial Intelligence Act, it calls for external auditors. Well, who is going to go in there and audit? Right now, there are no AI auditors. We're creating a whole field of people, a whole new profession with new certifications so that we can, in fact, have independent auditors going in there. My company, KPI, does pre-audits specifically so that we know at least a few people who know how to do these things. Kathy O'Neill, who wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, is another auditor based here in the United States, whom I strongly recommend for anybody who's interested in auditors. But ultimately, this idea of explainability is important at multiple levels. One, if, a system decides that you have committed a crime, right, whether it's shoplifting or something far worse, you need to be able to push back against that system. And at this point, prove that it's not you. And how are you going to do that unless you're able to look into the system and see what variables were used, what weights were used, what business logic is used? It's almost impossible for you or for your lawyer to be able to do that at this point, especially when more and more organizations are using black box systems, which means that they're proprietary. So they don't even know what's going into their systems. They don't know what training data is being used. So that's one of the great things about the AIA, for me at least, is that you will have to go under the hood and actually see what that training data is, which I think a lot of people will actually be shocked about. At the same time, I think that, if you are, again, somebody who's just starting to understand that you can use generative AI in limited ways to benefit your business, benefit your product, benefit your services, you need to be able to do experimentation. And we're seeing more and more large companies like Salesforce, like Google, that are saying, oh, don't worry about it. Do all of that experimentation. And if you get sued, our insurance will cover you. why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Because people are afraid, because they know that there could be lawsuits. Why are we afraid of lawsuits? Because there are lawsuits. So again, in terms of these lawsuits, that explainability is really, really necessary to be able to even have a conversation in front of the judge, in front of a jury. What are we talking about? We don't know. It's inside of a black box. So that explainability at that level is really important from the regulator's perspective, from the legal perspective, from your personal perspective. If you, again, get falsely accused of something, or even if you actually did it, you still need to be able to defend yourself. That explainability at these different levels mean different things. And if you're an engineer and you work for within an organization, and it's your job to be able to include the business logic into an actual algorithms or multiple algorithms that are, working together, you need to be able to explain it to other engineers the day that you leave. Others need to keep going. And so again, explainability is incredibly important for many reasons, and it looks differently for the different parties that we're talking about.
Just very finally, because you're there in the US, are you optimistic about regulation in the US?
The United States decided to follow in the footsteps of China. China had decided that they wanted AI supremacy by 2025. President Trump, who was president at the time, decided that the United States should get there first. As a result, we've got so much industrial policy against China, as you know. We've got the Bletchley Park signing that happened in December, where somewhere around 200 nations around the world signed to make sure that we develop advanced AI systems that will not destroy the world. I mean, these are really fundamental things that I don't think the day-to-day person is necessarily thinking about as they're, prompting their ChatGPT-4. But at the same time, these are all levels that are happening simultaneously. And in many ways, the things that we grew up with sci-fi, that the robots that are coming to take over or destroy the world, or, somewhere in between, all of that stuff is to the extreme. It's by starting to look at how we can regulate ourselves as humans that are part of this socio-technical system, and then regulate our systems. And again, what is the priority there? Is the priority our politics? Is the priority to have national or international superiority, or is our priority to work together as a global system to be able to deploy and do space exploration? These are very, very different goals. So we need to have a global conversation with all logics involved, all players, all listeners, hopefully to this podcast as well, and decide what's our priority. And from there, we can decide what our next steps are.
There are no simple solutions when it comes to the regulation of generative AI, and there is understandable concern among the public, as it can all feel a bit Minority Report. But one thing is for sure, it is going to take an open, transparent and global approach, and to that end work is well underway. In November of last year, 2023, the governments of 28 countries and the European Union signed the Bletchley Declaration on Global Cooperation in Artificial Intelligence. It was an agreement on how we might mitigate the risks of AI. The list of signatories included both the US and China, two countries that have not historically seen eye to eye when it comes to collaboration on technology. The EU Artificial Intelligence Act was endorsed by all EU member states in February 2024. The obligations under the Act will be phased in over a period of some 36 months, with the key obligations being in place within 24 months. The aim of the new regulation is to ensure that the fundamental rights, health and safety of the individual are protected while still promoting innovation, and to ensure that AI systems are designed, developed and deployed in an ethical and trustworthy manner. It states that unacceptable risks like emotion recognition technology in the workplace will not be allowed. High-risk areas such as health, recruitment and law enforcement will be subject to mandatory compliance, while medium-risk systems will be subject to transparency requirements. It's a model that's been examined by other countries around the world, with plans for regulation in the US and UK among others. On the copyright front, it requires all creators to, and I quote, respect European Union copyright law. The Act has its critics and its admirers, of course, but it is a start, and it is the envy of many I've chatted to in my own US tech network. When we're looking at technology that takes huge data sets and translates and summarises them into usable and actionable content, the potential for the future of healthcare, of drug discovery, of more accessible education and of climate change mitigation, to name just a few, is really huge. So ensuring that these systems are accurate, unbiased, trustworthy and trusted is in everybody's interest. As we look at an AI-powered future, it will take us all working together to ensure we get this right. But if we do, the payoff could be huge. This episode was curated by the Silicon Republic team and produced by Shaun and Maurice. The interviews were conducted by myself and Silicon Republic editor Jenny Darmody. The podcast is part of Future Human on Silicon Republic, and for more great content from filmed fireside chats to deep dive articles, visit siliconrepublic.com/future-human. Thanks again to our series sponsor Hayes, the experts in recruitment and workforce solutions.